participants. And as Anne mentioned, I've been at Parnassus almost 10 years now, so I've done this a few times, and it's exciting to be back here. One big thanks before we get started. Our core equity product, the fund, has been on your lineup for years and years and years. So we really do appreciate the long-term partnership with both Anne and team, as well as all the participants in the plan. As Anne mentioned, Marion's on as well. I'll more formally introduce Marion here in a few slides, but I'll kick us off with just some basic logistics and just some kind of table setting before I turn it over to Marion. From a logistical standpoint, if I remember right, there's an interface where folks can put questions as we go through the material. Of course, the easiest way is probably cover those at the end. So that's like what we'll do. If I see something come up that fits that we can work in, Marion, I'll jump in and ask it, but likely we'll just cover those at the end. We've planned for about 40 minutes of content. I know we have an hour, so that give or take will give us at least 10 minutes of questions at the end. So we always enjoy taking direct questions, and I think that makes it fun for everyone. And our goal here is to be purely educational. So obviously we'll give you some context on Parnassus and who we are and all those things, but the hope is that by sharing some of the ways we think about investing and investing with a purpose, that at the end of the hour, you guys will have a better understanding of just some of those concepts that you can apply, everywhere. If you move forward to the next slide, just a little bit of context on Parnassus, the firm. And Anne, I can share as well if it's easier for me to drive.
Okay, yep, I will stop sharing and you can try to share.
I think I have it. All right, can you guys see me okay?
Yes, and I'll make sure you have, want to make sure you have the remote control access. It looks like you do. Okay.
Yeah, I think I've got it. All right, thanks. Sorry for that. So just Parnassus, just in super brief, the firm was founded in 1984, so we've been around for a long time. We're kind of viewed as a pioneer in responsible investing. We've done it since the day the doors opened here, so it's always been part of the way we've invested. And the goal is really to do two things. So number one is beat the market, or whatever the benchmark is, and the strategies we manage. And then to do that in a responsible way, or a way we can feel good about. So that's kind of the purpose that we'll spend most of our time focused on today. Just a quick reminder, so you guys again have this Parnassus Core Equity Fund available in your lineup. One quick note, so I put the fund up here. In the last month or so, the team actually moved it over to a collective investment trust, or a CIT. Same strategy, same holdings, it's just a little bit cheaper. So thanks to the team for doing that. You can see some of the stats here. It's kind of a high conviction product. It typically holds about 40 stocks, so it's quite a bit different than its benchmark, the S&P 500. And it's really known for the first thing is the responsible investing piece, or the sustainable investing piece. The second is the risk return profile. So this chart on the right, you can see the fund versus its index there, and this shows the results from our lead portfolio manager, who's been running this product since 2001. Where the strategy on the up and down axis, the return is slightly higher than the benchmark or the index. And then on the bottom axis there, you can see the standard deviation, which is just another measure of risk, is a little bit less than the benchmark. So that's exactly what we'd love to see, is a little bit better return, a little bit less risk. So just wanted to share that with you all here as well. If we to the next slide. So enough of the commercial here. So I'll bring Marion in here, and you can see her background. Marion's managing director, head of our sustainable investment strategy, and I'll give her a minute to kind of walk through her experiences and how that relates to Parnassus, and we'll get started. Marion.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Scott, for the intro, and thank you, Anne and Angie, and thank you to all the participants and everyone for having me here. I'm a huge Maryland fan. I grew up in Allentown, Pennsylvania, so I went to the Chesapeake Bay for recreation. That's where I grew up, and it's the first nonprofit I ever donated to as a kid was the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and cracking crabs on newspapers there. So thank you very much for having me. As Scott mentioned, I'm the Managing Director of Sustainable Investment Strategy here at Parnassus. You can see on here, by way of background, I've had 4 jobs in ESG or sustainability, which I'll use those terms a bit interchangeably now. 2 of those were at companies. I was the head of ESG strategy and engagement at Uber, I was 7 years managing ESG issues at Chevron, which of course are two famous or notable companies for their sustainability profiles. And before that, I was director of investment stewardship at Charles Schwab. And before that, I was 7 years at a proxy advisory firm called Glass Lewis. And on the face of it, when you're looking at these jobs, you might think they're pretty disparate, pulling oil out of the ground and turning it into gasoline, or hailing rides and ordering food from Uber, or getting from one place to the other, or managing the sustainable investment characteristics of a $43 billion asset manager in San Francisco. But the fact is that at every single one of these jobs, including the one that I have now, my job has been exactly the same, which is to make money for our clients, for our investors. So it's really just switching seats at the exact same table. So I've been doing this about 21 years. And for 21 years, I've made the same joke that every day I go to work and I hang up my I care about people in the environment hat, and I put on my Monopoly Man mustache, because my job is to make money for shareholders. And that's at every job that I've had, including this one. And then I always hope that the Zoom doesn't cut out and everyone thinks, oh my gosh, that woman from Parnassus is a sociopath. Because the fact is that it is the same story. It's not a similar story, it's the same story, that if you don't take care of the natural and human capital on which your business relies, your business will not be successful in the long term. And that goes for every kind of company, right? And it goes for Parnassus, it goes for Starbucks, it's every company across all of our portfolios. All of these companies operate in ecosystems, and ecosystems of stakeholders, their employees and their customers. And if you have an operational footprint, your fence line neighbors, so who's living around your facilities, or regulators or communities. And if you don't fit into that ecosystem, you won't be successful in the long term. And every day you can see this manifesting, companies missing out on value because of the way they manage sustainability issues. Or even if the perceived performance on sustainability issues can affect a company's performance, stock performance as well. And I'll give you just a few real world examples so that you can take those home or try to understand a little bit more about how this can manifest. And the number one best example that I used to give and still give is the company where I used to work, right? Uber. They had an S problem, they had a G problem, and to a lesser extent, an E problem, so an environmental problem. And those sustainability problems cost the company billions of dollars. And I would argue they're still paying the piper today. They had a failed IPO. Do any of you guys remember the hashtag delete Uber campaign? I have friends that deleted the Uber app in 2017 and they have never used it again. So they'll use alternatives where they're available. And I think that that's a real example of how this stickiness of how you treat people and how you treat the environment, or how your company is governed, can have real impacts on your stock. So in 2017, when hashtag delete Uber came around, that was also the time when the original CEO left and the new CEO came in. His name is Dara. And when he came in, he was tasked with going to cities all around the world and asking, hey, I'm the new CEO of Uber. You're aware we've had some problems. We want to grow Uber in your city. And many mayors and cities around the world said, not only do we not want Uber to grow in our city, we don't want it in our city at all. And yes, some cities said that, notably London, huge markets where cities are saying, no, you're not welcome here anymore. And this is not an ESG problem or a sustainability problem that's somewhere off the balance sheet, right? Those are business problems. And since then, Uber's had to work on side, very hard to get on side with cities, which is their ecosystem. Cities is where Uber thrives, their ecosystem, treatment of drivers, the treatment of employees, safety. Once every 2 years, Uber puts out its safety report, and you'll see the safety statistics all over the news, right? Ethics, climate, and governance too. In fact, there's a museum of California in Sacramento, and there's an exhibit there all about how poorly Uber treats women, right? Is that good for business, right? This is an important consideration that companies that aren't considering the ecosystems in which they operate, they're leaving shareholder value on the table. And I'll just give one more example that maybe will be more relevant to you. I'm actually flying tomorrow to New York City, so it's very relevant to me. is, so we all have our algorithms, right? My algorithm pushes corporate malfeasance documentaries or podcasts. So on Netflix right now, there's a documentary called Downfall. I don't know if any of you guys have seen it, but it's called Downfall, the case against Boeing, right? And that catalogs the company's perceived cultural shifts over time away from safety, away from quality, away from human capital management to shorter term profit prioritization, which came at the expense of many things that many people believe is what made Boeing great and made Boeing trusted. So as you guys may remember, all of these changes led to the Boeing 737 MAX 8 plane being grounded in 2019 and again in 2024 for crashes that killed more than 350 people. And I don't know if you remember the video of the door blowing off the Alaska Airlines flight at 16,000 feet in the air. And you can ask, is that good for business? Right? So this is the kind of thing that we look at Parnassus. Is my job is to help us select quality companies for our funds, monitoring companies and sustainability issues that could affect their ability to deliver value to our clients. And 3 is engaging companies in our funds such that they more effectively consider their ecosystems as part of their operations and business strategy, and voting proxies as well. So we'll just go to the next slide very quickly. This is the team that works on these issues on behalf of our clients. They're all fantastic. But I'll go to the next slide just to round out. These are the principles by which we are evaluating companies. We want companies to cultivate a good workplace, which falls under the S in ESG if you're using those words. Minimize your environmental impact, which is E. Promote product responsibility, which could be E and S, right? Because these things are all very interconnected. And finally, and I would argue most importantly, is to have good governance and be a good corporate citizen. And that's the G part. And I have always believed and continue to believe that if you get governance right, so the people who are making decisions and the policies and practices that uphold those decisions, making sure the right people get the right information at the right times, that's G. If you get that right, everything else will fall into place. So that's an area that we follow very closely as well. So if you go to slide 8, we look, of course, sustainability is an important part of what we do, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on. But I want to just highlight, we're looking for companies that are increasing in relevancy. We want companies that have competitive advantages that are not short-term, but durable competitive advantages, strong management teams, attractive valuations, right? And sustainable business practices. And here in this far right column, you see some examples of how we execute on that in our strategies. So I'm going to start with a number to tell the story, just a little bit about sustainable business practices and how we think about it. And the number is 90. So Scott, you can go to the next slide if you would like. Thank you. So 90%. 90% of the S&P 500 value is intangible. And you can see on this slide that in 1975, that number was 17%. So more than a complete reversal. So if you liquidated every physical asset owned by every company in the S&P 500, so the factories, fleets, offices, the water coolers, you'd recover only about 10% of the index's total value. The remaining 90% is embedded in intangible assets, right? So think intellectual property, brands, data, technology, but also in your reputation, in human capital, and the ability to attract and retain, importantly, retain and engage, right? Customers and talent, and be granted the license to operate figuratively. And like, as I mentioned in the Uber case, sometimes quite literally. We're talking literally about, or in Boeing, right? Your literal license to operate with the products that you're, and services that you're supplying. And we can't pretend that there are 15 billion smartphones in the world right now. And they have cameras, and they have megaphones, and they have apps that do a whole myriad of things to share your opinions, to take, you can even take air quality samples. You could take soil quality samples. And this all changes the contours and accountability around sustainability issues. And I think you can see that too when you see how there's a real-time accountability for companies and how they're fitting into their ecosystems in ways that there wasn't back in 1975, right? So we believe at Parnassus that it's our responsibility to understand the sustainability practices of companies we're invested in, and then to engage those companies to drive behaviors and structures and governance that we believe are material and to help companies succeed in the long term. Right, so that sort of sums up the kinds of things we're looking about at and why. So if you go to the next slide, so I'm gonna, with great hubris, I will say any asset manager out there that uses sustainability as a characteristic in their evaluations have, generally speaking, 3 tools available to them. One is taking screening the investable universe to something smaller. Second is individual stock review and selection. And finally, stewardship, right? So that's 3 things: screening, stock review, stewardship. And we at Parnassus use all of them. So I'll describe what that means. So this slide here describes our sustainability lens, which is where it all begins. And this is a tool that we use to help us identify companies and industries that we believe are unlikely to meet our quality standards or our quality criteria, either through their product involvement, so what do you do for a living, or their business conduct, which is how they do what they're doing. And I just want to emphasize that at Parnassus, for us, these are not hard screens, right? The way it's a filtering mechanism to take, I always think of it as like you're a sculptor and there's a giant smooth cube of marble, and you take the sustainability lens is essentially our first cracks to take out big chunks away to ultimately get down to the Statue of David. And companies can go on the list, companies can come off the list, but it's meant to be a filtering mechanism to narrow the investable universe to companies most likely to deliver value to our clients. So example of companies going on and off, here's an example of companies coming on is the opioid manufacturers and distributors many years ago, right? And an example of companies coming off includes the opioid manufacturers and distributors, right? When we felt the material risks had been baked into the stock price and the policies and practices of the companies had improved such that they no longer represented risks to clients that they once did. So that's an example of companies coming on and companies going off based on changes in the materiality of the risks. And then another characteristic is business conduct. That captures not industries, but individual companies that we feel might fall short of our expectations and not help us. I think the first slide has our mission on it, which is to build wealth responsibly for long-term investors. So we're trying to find companies that will help us build wealth responsibly for long-term investors. So on the business conduct front, I'll just give you an example of a company that is on for business conduct. There's a multinational entertainment company that's currently on the list because it has been connected to about 200 deaths and about 750 injuries in less than 20 years. So these incidents include deaths and injuries committed by intruders, and also a stage collapse that killed 7 people and injured 61 others. And you guys may remember the Astro World in Houston, where 10 people died from compression asphyxia, so crowd crush, right? And there's actually, speaking of my corporate malfeasance documentaries, there's a documentary about this on Netflix as well, about the Astroworld tragedy. And so these are examples of companies where their patterns of behavior indicate to us that they're unlikely to meet our standards. Now, that doesn't mean they will always continue to or always fail to meet our standards, and that can change. And that's what makes the sustainability lens unique, is that we are able to discern companies that we believe are quality. And what happens after that is just because a company is not restricted or it's not on this list or filtered out by the sustainability lens, that doesn't mean that we're finished evaluating its sustainability characteristics. We also do sustainability reviews for every company before it's eligible for investment, trying to dig in and understand how the company is handling the most material risks and opportunities to its business. And we do that upon investment, and then we do it every year after. And we look at good, positive things, we look at negative things. The information comes from a variety of sources, including the company's own filings, news sources, and then to an extent we use raters and rankers as well to help us understand, but being very careful. And I always emphasize this, that using raters and rankers as a source of information, but never as a linear to decision making, because they can be wrong. And it's important that we use their information gingerly, so that when we make decisions, we can be confident they're the correct one. And an example I tell about this is there was a rater ranker report way back in the day when I worked at Chevron that evaluated Chevron's governance and ESG overall risk as worse than Rosneft and PetroChina. And when I saw that, working at Chevron, which is a San Francisco-based company, independent chairman, operates with excellence. Now, not to say that's not checkered at times, but it has an operational excellence culture and commitment that I experienced. So we called up the rater ranker and said, hey, why is it that this company has such a poor score relative to these other companies, Rosneft and PetroChina? And the answer they gave was they use news articles to help understand the risks, material risks at these companies. So if you're operating in a market without a free press, there aren't as many articles, right? So this is the kind of thing that you want to understand. And I believe, in fact, I'm fairly confident that that company has since vastly improved the quality of their ratings and rankings. But it was at that time where I said, this is great to read and to try to understand, but to look at ratings and rankings relative to other other companies is not linear to decision making. So once you've made it through these evaluations where we're looking at what's material, whether it's supply chain or environmental or safety, emissions, workplace, then we've decided your relevance and management and moat are all meeting our standards, then congratulations, you're one of the 200-ish companies that we own across our strategies. We bought this company, we like this company, we're a high conviction, long hold, quality companies that we believe in. But even those companies, we believe, have work to do, and Parnassus has a role to play in that as well. And that's where stewardship comes in. So I'll talk to you a little bit about what stewardship is, which can be separated further into proxy voting, which I love, having spent 21 years of my career thinking about proxy voting, engagement, and shareholder advocacy tools to help deliver value in our funds. So I'll start talking a little bit about where did this all start? These are all shareholder advocacy tools. And I'll talk about how we use these tools to deliver value and build value in the companies in our funds as well. So I'll talk about what it looks like in 2025. And I'm sure that all of you already know where this story starts. You can go to the next slide. It's 1602. Is that what everyone was going to raise their hand and say? It's going to be 1602. It's going to be the Dutch East India Company. Well, the Dutch East India Company, which I think is a very interesting story, was the very first company to issue equity shares to the public in 1602. The first public company, right? And it was governed by a president. It had an active board of directors, which was elected. And it was one of the biggest, most dominant corporations and evil companies in all of history. And it brought cool products like affordable tea and cotton and spices, and it brought a lot of money to investors as well, with returns as high as 30%. But do you know what else was 30%? The mortality rate for an employee of the Dutch East India Company. And they exploited workers, and they used slaves, and they traded slaves, and they destroyed some local economies with a profound ecological impact. And notably, it was also first to issue shares, and it was the first recorded expression of shareholder advocacy at a public company. So as soon as public companies existed, shareholder advocacy came along with it, and their tools were their votes. And they were pamphlets, just the same as communication we have now, pamphlets around port cities and protests in person at annual meetings, trying to advocate for change and agitating other investors to be concerned as well, mostly around governance. One other tool they used was, and I quote this here, smearing the account books with bacon grease so they might be eaten by dogs. That's not a tool that we use at Parnassus, because today, the way we do it, the way everyone, I don't think anyone's doing that anymore. It looks very different than it did 400 years ago. And it looks different than when I started doing this work in 2005. But the aims are essentially the same, right? Be accountable to your shareholders. That's governance. Take care of people, steward the environment. And the last one is make money for your investors. And I'll double click on that. Make money for your investors, because that's the name of the game, right? My job at Parnassus, which you'll hear me say over and over again, is to build wealth responsibly for long-term investors. And this, I said earlier too, if you don't take care of the natural and human capital on which your business relies, your business won't be successful in the long term. And at the heart of it, sustainability is about money. And at the heart of that is materiality, right? And that's how we make our decisions. How do these companies operate successfully? And how can we as investors choose companies that will deliver value to our clients, to our shareholders, and that will also try to make them better through our engagement and proxy voting. So you can go to the next slide. So I've said this before, it's our responsibility to understand the sustainable practices of companies that we're invested in. And these are the tools that we use for stewardship: engagement, proxy voting, and advocacy, all in service of long-term shareholder value. So if you'd like, you can go to the next slide. Thank you very much. So every year, our stewardship team selects issues that we believe are important, issues that we believe are material to many of the companies in our across our funds, including core equity. So these are the issues: climate change, and across on the other side of the slide, you can see our objectives in pursuing these issues. And not every one of these issues is applicable to every company, but they have broad applicability across funds and then also across companies in the funds as well. So climate, water risk, chemical safety, the responsible use of artificial intelligence, and governance. And then a subset of that is executive compensation, which I always say the smart mouse gets the cheese. So we want to make sure that executive compensation plans are aligned to performance for shareholders, right? And as I already said, if you get G right, everything else should fall into place. So that's one you'll never see drop off these slides is governance, because we believe that's an important area. And we spend a lot of time on our proxy voting as well. So if you go to the next slide, I'll talk about climate change, right? So this is one of the most pressing risks and opportunities facing the world. It's all of us are experiencing climate change in our own ways, and it's a risk and it's an opportunity. And a number that I often cite and that I often think of is so my mind is in a Time magazine spread where I'm just saying 90% of the S&P 500. Well, here's another one, is 143. And that was a land surface temperature in India, right? It was a record 143 degrees. Now, admittedly, it was land surface. It wasn't an air temperature, right? So, but tires are melting on the tarmac at the airports. And I always think about puppy paws on the ground when it's 143 degrees for land surface. July 3rd of last year, I think it was last year, was the hottest day ever recorded globally. And another number that I think is 101, which was a water temperature last year off the coast of Florida in a place called Manatee Bay. And I think about my dad, and he sets his hot tub to 103. And I'm imagining the water off the coast of Manatee Bay at 101 degrees, right? So this is a picture, speaking of my dad, that he took he worked on the bottling line at a winery in Oregon. And he took this picture at his workplace in Oregon. And those are tubs of grapes in the foreground. I don't know how many of you guys have been to a winery. This is a working winery. And the picture isn't doctored. This was the color of the sky. I don't know if you saw, I lived in California at the time. This was in 2020. And for those of us who were in the West Coast, California, in Oregon, this is very, in the middle of the pandemic, it felt like end of days orange, right? This really was the color of the sky. So this is important to companies. So if you go to the next slide, we want to know what our portfolio companies are doing about it, right? And this isn't just what are your emissions, right? Your impact on climate change. But we also want to know these companies' plan in a changing world. And this isn't because we so want to improve the world and change the world, which we do. It's because we want to know that we won't be the ones as investors holding the bag at companies that don't see the writing on the wall, right? There will be serious direct impacts from climate change, both physical impacts and transition impacts. And how will these companies not only survive and limp through these changes, but thrive in a changing world? So here's some examples you can see on here of comparing core equity to the benchmark for greenhouse gas emissions and emissions reduction targets. And here's just some examples. For example, we have engaged a home builder, right? A home builder that was subject to a class action lawsuit for allegedly inadequately building homes in Louisiana for the water, for humidity, for inadequate drainage, for mold on the walls, right? So that's a long-term strategic issue for these companies. Or, I don't have a slide or an example here on water, but that's another one of our areas of importance. And one of those areas of importance is the semiconductor industry, major water user. I've seen it estimated. This was actually last year's estimate too, so I'm sure it's higher now, which is as much as more than 260 billion gallons of water a year. So to put that into perspective, a single modern fab for semiconductors might use 10 million gallons a day. And the water can't just be regular water, right? It has to be ultra pure water for use in cooling and processing. So a Taiwan Semiconductor, for example, reports usage in the tens of billions of gallons per year. And now TSMC is building a new fab, an additional fab in Phoenix. So I'm not a meteorologist, but I know Phoenix is hot, and I know that it's dry. And I know based on reading that it's only going to get worse, and that there's also competition in the basin, right? Like there was a moratorium on new build that relies on groundwater in Phoenix, right? So we have engaged the company on science-based emissions reduction targets, which they have since set. And we've engaged the company on water use and trying to get it to increase the amount of reused, recycled water as well. And we went to Phoenix to visit the Water Policy Center there to discuss what is the competing needs for water in the basin, and how should companies like TSMC, how should they be thinking about water management in the area? And we left there feeling comfortable with the company's approach to it, and also understanding that Phoenix is hot, and you don't have to be a meteorologist to know that. And that's one of the issues that we are engaging on. So we're urging companies to set emissions reduction targets, and we're also asking them to set water risk plans and water positive commitments where it makes sense, where it's material. Climate change is very global, and water risk is very local. And so we're asking companies where it's material, or if they're operating in high stress regions, or where there's a lot of competition in the basin, or flooding can be as problematic as drought, right? Because we were talking about the water quality in addition to water quantity. So those are two of the issues that we engage on. And maybe go to the next slide. Another area that we engage on is chemical safety. And I don't know how much attention you're paying to these issues. I walk into the airport magazine store, and I see Consumer Reports talking about it, or I see it in Wall Street Journal or in the New York Times about chemical safety. And as you can see from this slide, global chemical production has grown 50-fold since 1950, but fewer than 1 in 5 have been tested for toxicity. And we're seeing the impact with increases in immune and thyroid diseases, a 35% rise in childhood cancers, a doubling of male reproductive birth defects, and PFAS, or forever chemicals. I'm sure you've heard that phrase. They're in shampoo. They're in your dental floss, right? These chemicals are being regulated to some extent in some places, but they're also not, right? So, I know it's last year around Halloween, there was a lot of articles about and I hated to hear this, the wrapping for Reese's peanut butter cups. And PFAS in there, PFAS in the watch bands of the Apple Watch, right? It's estimated. So there was already $10 billion fine for 3M about PFAS cleanup, but it's estimated that it might be up to 30 billion in liabilities. So when you see those numbers, I would urge you to say that's real money. That's not only real money, that's your money as shareholders, right? That is your money. And it's important that companies are taking care of the ecosystems in which they operate so that they're not unnecessarily spending their money on litigation or on fines or on dramatic retooling or reprocessing of products that otherwise would not have needed to do so. And if you skip down very quick, sorry to make you do this, Scott, but if you go down to slide 22, you can see here's just some examples of companies that we have been engaging. These are, we're asking them, hey, map your chemical footprints, build out risk management plans, and where it makes sense. And it doesn't always make sense. It doesn't always make business sense or even practical sense to transition away from these chemicals. Like that's not our goal, isn't to say, stop using these. The goal is to transition away where it makes sense. Where it makes sense to do so. So footprint your chemicals, make risk plans, and then phase out of these chemicals where it makes sense to do so. I'll very briefly touch on proxy voting. So if you want to go back to slide 17, sorry for, don't want anyone to get nausea going back and forth to these, slide 17, yeah, proxy voting. Oh, I love proxy voting. How many of you guys get your proxy ballots in the mail and just throw them away? Well, I would urge you not to do so. It's a very important and underappreciated part of asset management and investment. And it's an important part of being a company because proxy voting is the primary way that investors talk to boards of directors. So boards oversee management, management manages the company, and we, shareholders like you, we oversee the board. So you're imagining this pyramid where you are at the top of the structure, overseeing the board of directors, which manages management teams. And every year, every publicly traded company in the United States is required to hold a meeting, typically the annual shareholder meeting, where investors get to weigh in on how the company is being run, right? And there's a couple categories of things. One is who sits on the board, how executives get paid. And you're going to see that in the news now, right? Because there's the new Elon Musk Tesla pay package, which could be up to, some of the news articles say $1 trillion, right? How executives get paid. Smart Mouse gets the cheese. We vote on that at every company. Who audits the financials? And then another mergers and proxy contests, right? And finally, there's one last category about ESG issues. And these are called shareholder proposals. And in my opinion, they are the epitome of shareholder democracy. And if you own $2,000, now you can take this with a grain of salt because there's a few other rules in here, but generally speaking, if you own $2,000 in stock for at least 3 years, you can put a proposal on the ballot for every shareholder at the company to vote on, right? And that is subject to some criteria. And those criteria are tightening, as you can imagine, as now you're hearing what a powerful tool this is, right? So those criteria are tightening, but it's our responsibility to look at these issues and weigh in on them. And I'll just give you one quick example of a proposal that we weighed in on, that was on a ballot, which was at Amazon, where the proposal was that the company do an independent review, excuse me, of one of its products, which is a facial recognition technology. Right, and so it can recognize faces, it recognizes backgrounds, it can assign emotions, right? Trying to guess these things. And the review was asking the company to evaluate the risks that this technology poses to stakeholders and the implications of government entities using this software and whether or not it infringes on civil rights. And at that time, Amazon had a moratorium on selling it to police. So that was an area where we looked at what are the risks here to the company's value? What are the risks to shareholders of this? And what are peers doing, right? So other companies like Microsoft have similarly taken a stance to eliminate and or limit the sale of similar technologies because of these concerns. So our responsibility is to look at proposals like this and technologies like this and exposures like this and make decisions on behalf of our shareholders to further their investments. So just to, so you know how it ended up, that proposal got around 38% support from all shareholders, so 38%. But at that time, Bezos owned around 9%. So you can imagine that unaffiliated shareholders really did think this was an issue and something they wanted to understand at the company. So that's our proxy voting. And then finally, shareholder advocacy, which again, we don't have a slide for, but that is an area where we get out and about and try to talk to companies and other investors about materiality, kind of what we're doing with you, where we want people to understand what is materiality, what are the sustainability issues that matter to your company, and help them understand why it's important to take care of the natural and human capital on which your business relies. So I think I can end there. Or if you're interested, we can walk through some of these case studies, or I'm happy to answer questions as well. This is a very important area for us, and I am very grateful for the opportunity to speak to you guys, and I'll turn it over to Scott there or to questions.
Thank you so much.